I am a methods editor with Cochrane Public Health, and I work at the Glasgow Caledonian University, where I'm the Ilse Mackay postdoctoral fellow at the Wise Centre for Economic Justice. And I'm very pleased to be here today to present the results of this methods project for Cochrane. I want to start by acknowledging the expert advisory group who supported this project, Carrie herself, Julian Higgins, Peter Tugwell, Beverly Shea, Lisa Barrow, and Jen Hilgart. They were very generous with their time and expertise, and I'm very grateful. So non-randomized studies may be included in Cochrane reviews of interventions for a number of reasons. They may be needed, for example, to answer questions about adverse effects of treatments or in the evaluation of public health policies. They may be the best available evidence, for example, in some rare diseases. But whenever non-randomized studies are included in systematic reviews, there are several methodological challenges to be met. This project addresses one such challenge, the choice or selection of a risk of bias tool for non-randomized studies of interventions. And just to be clear, this project was limited to NRSI tools and did not consider risk of bias tools for randomized trials. So there is a wide variety of study designs that fall into the category of non-randomized or quasi-experimental or observational studies, and a range of terms that are used to describe these studies. This word cloud is based on a review of natural experiment studies, and it indicates the diverse and sometimes unfamiliar or complex methodology in this area. Each study design may involve different underlying assumptions and potential risks for bias and confounding. Whatever the design, of course, assessment of risk of bias is essential, but it's also challenging because the sources of bias are diverse, the designs can be complex, there's a lack of study registration and often poor reporting in these designs, and there is, of course, the potential for unmeasured confounding in the absence of randomization. So it perhaps follows that there is a wide variety of risk of bias tools for non-randomized studies. In July 2017, the Cochrane Scientific Committee issued a recommendation, which is shown here. And that recommendation stated that Robin's Eye is the preferred tool for Cochrane reviews. And an alternative that was recommended was the Newcastle-Ottawa scale. So this guidance is clear, but it does say that it's not mandatory, and it notes that expertise and time are required to implement Robin's Eye. Another consideration is that the study designs covered by these two tools are at present limited to cohort and case control studies, although that may change in the future. So accordingly, in addition to the two tools shown here, Cochrane author teams continue to use a variety of risk of bias tools for non-randomized studies of interventions. And this creates an issue for editors and reviewers, as well as author teams, with editors and reviewers needing to consider whether the use of each tool is appropriate and justified on a case-by-case basis. So Cochrane commissioned a short research project to identify preferred and acceptable risk of bias tools for NRSI, essentially when Robin's Eye or Newcastle-Ottawa might not be appropriate for a particular review. I led this project with the help and support of the expert advisory group I mentioned at the start of the presentation. The project was undertaken between September 2021 and March 2022, and the expert advisory group met online 3 times during that period. So previous systematic reviews of risk of bias tools for non-randomized studies, starting with John Deeks's HTA back in 2003, have identified literally hundreds of risk of bias tools for non-randomized studies of interventions. But there is, as you can see from these pull quotes, a lack of consensus on which tools are preferred. On the other hand, you could say there is a relatively strong consensus about the need for rigorously developed tools that support consistent risk of bias assessments. There are not, to my knowledge, any standards for the development and reporting of risk of bias tools, and no established criteria for evaluating or selecting tools. So in this project, in order to identify preferred and acceptable tools, we needed to create a method for tool evaluation and selection, starting with what might be the characteristics or criteria that we could use to differentiate and evaluate or compare the different tools. So from systematic reviews of tools, of which there were several, I extracted all of the criteria that had been used by different researchers over the past 18 years to describe, compare, and evaluate tools for risk of bias in non-randomized studies. I then grouped the criteria under 5 categories: structure and presentation of the tool, the methods used to develop it, the content of the tool, so the actual bias domains and signaling questions that were used, the evaluations of the performance of the tool, its validity and reliability, and then a group of characteristics that here are called user perceptions. So characteristics that will can only be judged by the people using the tool, and that this assessment will vary from one group of users to another. Working with the expert advisory group, duplicate, overlapping, or inoperable criteria were eliminated so that we had a short list of 36 potential criteria for evaluating risk of bias tools. So how to decide among or prioritize from this list of potential criteria. We then undertook an online survey of Cochrane members to collect views on the relative importance of different criteria for selecting a risk of bias tool. This screenshot shows an excerpt from the survey instrument. Ethical approval was obtained from the GSBS Ethics Committee of Glasgow Caledonian University. The survey was conducted between December 2021 and January 2022 using the REDCap survey platform. Survey completion was anonymous and no data on individual participant characteristics were collected. Respondents were asked to rate the importance of each criterion as essential, desirable, unimportant, or not sure in terms of the role of that criterion in the decision of whether to use a particular risk of bias tool for non-randomized studies. The invitation to participate was circulated by the methods team to relevant Cochrane groups, and 41 people responded. All of the 36 criteria were rated either essential or desirable by a majority of respondents. So all of the criteria were either essential or desirable, with only 2 exceptions: the use of standard psychometric techniques in development of the tool, which potentially overlapped with other questions, and the use of a quantitative summary score, which of course is discouraged in the Cochrane handbook. The survey results were then discussed with the expert advisory group, and the group's consensus was to prioritize those criteria that had been rated essential in the survey by more than 50% of respondents. So this resulted in a final list of 22 criteria for use in identifying preferred and acceptable risk of bias tools. I will briefly run through these now, but you can also view the survey instrument, the results, the evaluation spreadsheet that I'll mention in a moment, and these slides in my GitHub repository on NRSI, and there's a link at the end of the presentation. So no worries about taking in all of these details on the first go. The first 5 criteria that were rated essential by more than half of respondents were these 5 relating to the structure and presentation of the tool. So the user guidance, the training materials, documentation, formatting, and output. The next grouping from the methods used to develop the tool related to whether the methods had been documented and reported, included consultation with experts, included user testing or pilot testing, and disclosure of any conflicts of interest on the part of the developers. Next, under the content of the tool, more than half of respondents rated as essential these criteria: that the tool assesses confounding selection bias, information bias, reporting bias, and that it includes a method for arriving at an overall risk of bias judgment. The two criteria relating to the performance of the tool, evaluation of its validity and reliability in some format, were prioritized as well. But what I'd like to draw your attention to in particular, so those are 16 criteria that can be assessed, if you will, objectively, based on the content of the tool itself, its supporting documentation, and any published assessments of its validity and reliability. But 7 of the original 36 long-listed criteria related to user views and experiences, or call them user perceptions. And 6 of these 7 were rated essential for selecting a risk of bias tool by more than 50% of respondents. So these criteria, as you can see, whether the questions or criteria are easy to interpret, that the performance of the tool is considered good, that the tool is easy to use, and that the time and methodological expertise required are considered feasible by the team using the tool. These will be rated differently by different review teams, depending on their particular circumstances, their experience, and their views of the tool. And just to clarify, by feasible within the context of the review, we meant within the time and resources available to the review team, including any constraints, particularly in terms of time, placed by the funder. So the exercise of extracting potential criteria from existing systematic reviews of tools, and then surveying Cochrane members about which of those criteria would be most important to them in selecting a preferred or acceptable risk of bias tool, produced this list of 22 criteria. And we then piloted those by applying only the 16 criteria relating to structure, development, content, and performance to assess Robin's Eye and Newcastle Ottawa as kind of baseline comparisons, since they are already recommended by the Cochrane Scientific Committee, and 5 other tools for NRSI that are commonly used in Cochrane reviews. Judgments of whether the criteria were met or not were based on the documentation publicly available on the tool's respective websites, the content of the tools and their supporting materials, and any publications on their development and performance that were identified in the literature search. Only Robin's Eye met all 16 of the criteria that were prioritized in the survey. Newcastle Ottawa was the next best performing tool against the criteria, meeting 12 of the 16 criteria. And another tool, the Effective Public Health Practice Project quantitative assessment tool, also met 12 of the 16 criteria. So these are 3 tools that were examined in the project whose development has been most thoroughly documented and which have been the subject of peer-reviewed validation studies, as well as offering comprehensive consideration of the different content areas of risk of bias that were prioritized. The other tools that we've considered as examples in this pilot exercise met between 5 and 9 of the 16 criteria. So we could say the other tools that were considered had limitations in terms of how well the methods for their development had been documented, or the coverage of the tool and its supporting materials. A few caveats are in order here. The criteria and the number of criteria met aren't intended to be used as a quantitative evaluation score, but only for relative comparisons of the strengths and limitations of different tools. They're only based on publicly available documentation, and more information might be available from the tool's developers that would change the conclusions. Also, new versions of tools or new supporting materials may be published in future that would change the assessments. Now, it's also clear that the 6 user perception criteria will be important in the comparative assessment of tools. So these considerations, including ease of use, time and expertise required, and perceived acceptability of the tool's validity and reliability, could potentially tip the balance, if you will, in favor of tools that may not have been as rigorously developed or thoroughly documented if they were perceived to be valid, quick, and easy to use. And I've just shown here the details of the EPHPP tool in case that's unfamiliar to anyone in the audience. So comparing a selection of tools against criteria prioritized by a small sample of Cochrane members and an expert advisory group, the findings of this project independently support the existing scientific committee's recommendations of Robin's Eye as a preferred tool and Newcastle Ottawa as an alternative based on their rigor of development, documentation, and content. EPHPP met the same number of criteria as Newcastle Ottawa, and therefore might also be considered an acceptable tool. And EPHPP also has an advantage of being applicable to a number of different non-randomized study designs that aren't currently addressed by Robin's Eye or Newcastle Ottawa. So it could help to fill a gap in one's toolbox in that way. The project report offers 4 recommendations, which should be considered in conjunction, of course, with Chapter 25 of the Cochrane Handbook, Assessing Risk of Bias in a Non-Randomized Study. The first recommendation is that in addition to the existing guidance on Robin's Eye and Newcastle Ottawa, that we might consider EPHPP an acceptable tool for risk of bias assessment of non-randomized studies of interventions. The second is that the method that we developed in this project could then be applied by other review teams, author groups who are considering the use of a different risk of bias tool for NRSI, and that they could assess the proposed tool against the 22 identified criteria in order to take into account how their tool under consideration compares to the existing preferred and acceptable tools for Cochrane reviews. Having done that, the choice of tool and the rationale for that choice should be documented in the methods section of the review with reference to the criteria matrix, the coverage of the study designs to be assessed, and any other relevant considerations. And the idea is that this would help not only to be more transparent about what has happened in the review methodology, but also to save the editors and reviewers the work that prompted this project in the first place, which is needing to investigate, you know, every tool that happens to be selected for use. And finally, having mapped the strengths and limitations of the tool, any limitations should be noted in the discussion section, together with any consideration of how the review's results and conclusions may or may not have been affected by the choice of tool. So these were the findings and the conclusions and recommendations of this particular project. It does not at present consist new guidance or methodological requirements from Cochrane. It is just what has been presented to the methods team in response to the research brief that they offered. Thanks very much for listening today. You're very welcome to contact me on email or via Twitter. And you can find materials relating to today's presentation in the NRSI repository that I'm building on GitHub. So the slides, the survey instrument, the results of the survey, and a kind of spreadsheet checklist with the 22 criteria for evaluation can be found in that repository.